The Sega Master System is one of the greatest tragedies in video game history. Originally released in Japan on October 20th, 1985, the Sega Master System, or Sega Mark III if you were in Japan, was the third attempt by Sega to build a successful home console. It really lived on the premise that it had superior hardware to the NES, but it was quickly killed off by the very scummy way Nintendo used to handle licenses. Back then, if Nintendo licensed you the rights to develop a game for the NES, then you weren't allowed to develop that game for other platforms. There were exceptions to this, of course, but this anti-competitive practice severely restricted the library size of the Master System. In total, there are 313 games, but only around 25% of them were released in Japan and North America. Today, I'm going to take a look at 5 Sega Master System games, in no particular order, to see if the failure was justified, or if it was really a sleeping giant crushed by the thumb of Nintendo. The first game up on the list is Sonic the Hedgehog, because you really can't talk about Sega without talking about Sonic. Initially, I kind of figured this would just be a port of Sonic 1 with worse visuals. Instead, it's actually a standalone Sonic game with a few unique additions. Before each level, you get a glance at the world map, and that's a really nice, small detail addition. The gameplay is pretty much the same as every other 2D Sonic game, but a little bit slower. You run, you jump, you roll, and if you finish a stage with a high enough ring count, you get a bonus stage. But it's pretty far from being an exact copy of the Genesis version. In line with that, this game has auto-scrolling levels, more akin to a Mario game than a Sonic game. The biggest takeaway from this is how much better it looks than the NES. Like, the NES had a couple of good-looking games, but I can't immediately think of any that look this good. This is a good sign, and I'm a bit more optimistic about what's to come. Next up on the list is Dick Tracy. The best way I can describe this is a case of under-promise and over-deliver. It's based on the 1990 film of the same name, and before this, the only other Dick Tracy game I had played was the NES version. That one is notorious for how poorly made it is. This version, on the other hand, fucking slaps. It's a side-scrolling shooter beat-em-up hybrid with really tight controls and objectively superior visuals to its NES counterpart. This game is actually what I thought Sonic the Hedgehog was going to be. It's a previous gen port of the Sega Genesis version, and it does a really good job at it. You punch dudes, shoot dudes, and if you hold the attack button down, you spray your Tommy gun toward this little cursor on your screen. The enemies in the foreground are handled by shooting or punching them, while the enemies in the background are handled entirely by the Tommy gun. If I'd been given this game as a kid, I think I would have been more than satisfied with it. There's good fun to be had here. Our third game today is Lord of the Sword, released in 1988. This game starts out with some story that makes it sound like a direct sequel to something. Here's a quick summary. Several thousand years ago, the demon lord Ra-Gowan was defeated by something. Cut to the present day, where cultists who worship Ra-Gowan have assassinated the king of Balginia as a sacrifice to resurrect their god figure. This creates a wave of lawlessness around the kingdom, but a high council decides that the next king will have to earn the throne by completing 3 tasks. The tasks required to become king are as follows. Find a tree that serves as the symbol of the royal family, kill the big-ass goblin at Balala Valley, and destroy an evil statue. Apparently this kingdom thinks the best person suited to run their lives must be a regular-ass adventurer, because these don't exactly sound like Herculean tasks. The player assumes the role of Landau, a stoic hero type who can swing a sword for sure, but his ability to use a bow is questionable at best. Seriously, look at how long it takes to draw and fire this thing. This is a side-scrolling action game with a pseudo-open world case. In reality, you can only change the screen by touching the left or the right edge, but where you are when you touch the screen will change where you end up on the other side. It's not the most intuitive world design I've ever seen, but at least it isn't terrible. The combat is pretty terrible. Enemies are abundant, but the combat itself isn't designed to be very fast. There are often too many enemies at once and not enough time for inputs. To make things worse, the Sega Master System has a very limited controller layout to work with. It's similar to the NES. To swing the sword, you press button 1. To shoot the bow, you press button 2. Well, and how do you jump, I hear you say? You press up on the D-pad. Seriously, this was a terrible decision. It should have been 1 to attack, 2 to jump, and up plus button 1 simultaneously to fire the bow. That would have put the controls on par with Castlevania, which by extension would have fixed the too many enemies problem. It's amazing how a small issue like this can make such a big difference. I think I wasted enough time on this one though, so let's move on. Game number 4 is a pretty weird one. Golvellius in the Valley of Doom, released in 1988, is a remake of a game released on MSX in 1987 called Devil Golvellius. This is a similar story to Highlight, in which the opportunity to make a better game was just taken advantage of. That said, unlike Highlight, this is mostly a Zelda clone. On starting the game, you make your way through a weird and poorly made one-way side-scroller level. The main enemy in this game is snakes. There are a lot of snakes. The first mini-boss at the end of this level is a giant snake, and I think the reason for that is because Valley of Doom is secretly just code name for Arizona. But the actual bulk of the game, the top-down world perspective, looks an awful lot like a stereotype outright American desert. There are cow skulls laying around and cactus, and there are snakes just everywhere. The difference between this and an American desert is that there are fairies and old women living in holes all over the valley. On practically every screen, there's a hole. Some of them will sell you useful items, some of them will give you hints, some of them are price gouging denizens just trying to charge double what the last vendor wanted for a health potion, and some of them just spout out bullshit. Other holes will take you to other parts of the game. I walked into one, suddenly the game was a vertical auto-scroller, and then I fought a giant bat, and then I fought an abominable snowman, and I gave up. I don't know what the hell this game is trying to be, and I don't think it does either. It functions, it works, it doesn't feel bad, but it's a weird amalgamation of stuff blended together into a snake-filled soup. Once again, I've saved the best for last. Mortal Kombat, released in 1993, is an extremely downgraded port of the arcade smash hit of the same name. I don't need to explain Mortal Kombat. Your grandma probably sunk quarters into Mortal Kombat at some point. It got ports on everything from Game Boy to PlayStation 5, and the Sega Master System was no exception. But here's the thing. This version of the game wasn't intended to release here in North America, and we should be very thankful for that. Mortal Kombat as a whole would have had a far worse reputation today if this were the introduction that kids were given. Visually speaking, it doesn't look terrible. They decided to stick with the actor sprites instead of drawing new ones, and even though they're bit crushed to hell, they still look pretty good. What isn't good is the actual game. You have two buttons, one punch, one kick. Combining those buttons with directions is how you change what kind of attack you're doing. It's not very complicated, and it sort of functions, but it isn't really the crisp fighting game snappiness that you would expect. The biggest drawback for this entire experience is that the computer enemy does not have any AI. Everything the computer does is an exact mirror of what you, the player, are doing, and that means you're pretty much always going to get hit. I figured out that you can bait a hit and block, and then use the opening to land a hit, but the enemy recovers faster than you can deal any combo damage. I feel like this would have at least been an acceptable two-player experience, but playing it solo is totally pointless. I also couldn't figure out how special moves worked. I managed to throw an ice ball, but couldn't get it to happen consistently, and that's a drag. Mortal Kombat's special moves are a ton of the overall charm. Without being able to do them, it feels really dull and restrictive. It's almost like playing a bootleg, but with the added disgust of knowing that this was actually released officially by Midway. I can't believe anybody would have looked at this and been like, fuck yes, this is top quality video games. Realistically speaking, it doesn't even deserve a fuck it good enough. This was just a blatant attempt at milking the money cow with a low-key demographic. And that was 5 Sega Master System games. At the beginning of the video, I wanted to know if the console itself was justifiably ignored, and I can honestly say that I feel like the failure is probably the fault of Nintendo. Some of these games were really good, and even the ones that weren't so good were proof of the claim that the Master System hardware was superior to the NES. If it weren't for Nintendo's crap practices, the Master System would have at least had the opportunity to be more successful in North America. I can't speak to whether or not we would still have Sega releasing consoles today if not for all of that, but I can say confidently that they did a damn good job with what they had back then, and I'm glad I spent the time giving it a chance. Thank you, and have a nice day.